You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host today is Michelle Jewel Shaw, chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Jeremy, and hello to all of our listeners out there.
Today is October 17th, 2021, and this is episode 141 of Lighthearted. In a few minutes, we'll listen to a conversation about a Massachusetts lighthouse that's way off the beaten track for most people, Tarpaulin Cove Light in the Elizabeth Islands off Cape Cod. It's really not very well known, but it has a lot of interesting history. We'll also be talking about the lost lighthouse of Cuttyhunk, another one of the Elizabeth Islands. Before we do that, has anything interesting happened on this date in lighthouse history, Michelle?
Well, on October 17, 1804, John Cooper, a plantation owner on St. Simon's Island in Georgia, deeded 4 acres of his land at the south end of the island for $1 to the federal government for the construction of a lighthouse. A 75-foot lighthouse tower was constructed, mostly made of tabby, which is a mixture of oyster shell, lime, sand, and water. The 104-foot tall brick lighthouse that stands today at St. Simon's Island was built in 1872. There's a museum in the keeper's house.
Yeah, I'll be visiting there in a few weeks as part of a trip to Georgia and South Carolina, and I'm really looking forward to it. I plan to feature St. Simon's on an upcoming episode of this podcast. For now, let's tell everyone about the lighthouses at Tarpaulin Cove and Cuttyhunk and our guest.
Sure, Jeremy. The Elizabeth Islands are a chain of small islands that extend about 16 miles to the southwest from the southern coast of Cape Cod. The islands, which were named for the Queen of England by the explorer Bartholomew Gosnold in the early 1600s, are the dividing line between Vineyard Sound to the south and Buzzards Bay to the north. There are 7 major islands and 22 in all. Collectively, the islands constitute the town of Gosnold, the least populated municipality in Massachusetts.
Coastal shipping traffic in the area was heavy by the early 1800s. In 1830, a total of 12,603 vessels were observed passing Cuttyhunk, the outermost of the islands. Cuttyhunk's first lighthouse was built at the island's southwestern tip in 1823 for $3,000. By 1860, the original stone tower was in poor condition and was torn down. A second story was added to the keeper's house, along with a short tower and lantern on the roof.
Cuttyhunk Light Station was rebuilt again in 1891. A 45-foot tall conical stone tower was constructed, along with an attractive wood frame keeper's house. A succession of keepers and their families lived at the station. The daughter of Cuttyhunk's last keeper, Simone Ponsart Roberts, recorded her memoirs in the book Everyday Heroes, the true story of a lighthouse family. The light station was demolished in 1947 because it was believed it was about to succumb to erosion.
The Elizabeth Island's other lighthouse stands on Naushon Island, the largest of the Elizabeth Islands at 7.4 square miles. Tarpaulin Cove on the east side of the island was for many years a bustling little harbor where the local farmers did business with the crews of incoming vessels. Seamen traveling through Vineyard Sound often stopped for a meal or a night's stay at a tavern run for many years by Zaccheus Lumbert.
Lumbert established an early navigational light in 1759 for the, and I quote, public good of whalemen and coasters, end quote. Lumbert and his successors maintained the light for nearly 6 decades. The federal government authorized the establishment of a more substantial lighthouse on the west side of Tarpaulin Cove in 1817. A rubble stone tower went into service in October 1817, exhibiting a fixed white light 71 feet above the water.
In 1888, the old stone keeper's house was replaced, and in 1891, a new 38-foot brick lighthouse tower was built with a 4th-order Fresnel lens. A 1,200-pound fog bell in a tower with striking machinery was installed. After the light was automated in 1941, the house and other buildings fell into disrepair and were torn down in 1962.
Most of the Elizabeth Islands, including Nashan, are privately owned by the Forbes family. The lighthouse tower at Tarpaulin Cove is now maintained by the Cuttyhunk Historical Society. The society was launched in 1978 and operates the Museum of the Elizabeth Islands on Cuttyhunk.
Paul Elias is a longtime summer resident and a trustee of Naushon Island. As a member of the Gosnold Electric Light Commission, Paul led the implementation of new solar power grids for the islands of Nashan and Cuttyhunk. He's also a former board member of the Cuttyhunk Historical Society. I had the opportunity to speak with Paul Elias recently. Let's listen to that now. I'm speaking today with Paul Elias, who has a long association with the Cuttyhunk Historical Society and is the point person for Tarpaulin Cove Lighthouse on Naushon Island. Thank you so much for being with me today, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Good to be here.
So, Paul, you are a summer resident of Naushon Island. There's not a lot of summer residents of that island.
There's about 40 houses on Naushon and the islands, the small islands connected to it. So there's, in August, there might be 200 people on the island.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
They're pretty much out of sight when you're there at Tarpaulin Cove. I could see one house when I was there recently. I wasn't aware, actually, that there were that many houses on the island.
Yeah, the primary cluster of houses is at the east end near Woods Hole.
More people in the summer than I realized. The Elizabeth Islands are a really interesting place, I think, but they're probably not that familiar to a lot of the listeners of this podcast, people who don't live in that general vicinity. What are some of the things that are notable about the Elizabeth Islands?
In history, what's most notable is that they really represent a very undeveloped area of, maybe 10 square miles of kind of Cape Cod landscape that really has its original forests and wetlands and fields pretty much intact. It has never been built up, and it's carefully managed to be a natural environment.
The island chain is pretty much the border between Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound, right? Vineyard Sound.
That's right. It divides those two bodies of water.
Both bodies of water have tremendous history, but let's talk a bit about Vineyard Sound. What is so important about Vineyard Sound, or historically, what was so important about the sound?
Vineyard Sound was a tremendously important passageway in the late 18th and 19th centuries for shipping traffic between Boston and New York, and even maybe between New York and London or in European ports. What I've heard is that it was one of the most heavily trafficked waterways in the world, outside, maybe second to the English Channel.
I have heard that, yeah.
It was very, very important for commerce and for passenger ships and a lot of things.
And I guess that has something to do with the fact that Tarpaulin Cove, the little harbor on Naushon Island, got an early navigational light in 1759. There were only a handful of lighthouses on the North American continent at that time.
Yeah, what I've heard is, again, you may know better, but I've heard that this was the fifth kind of permanent lighthouse location on the East Coast of North America, or at least in New England. And that really derived from the fact of the critical nature of Vineyard Sound as a thoroughfare. And also the fact that Vineyard Sound had sideways currents. The tide ran very fast through Vineyard Sound, still does, but also had a sideways component because the water fed between the islands. And as a result, it was a very treacherous body of water. And Eldridge's Coast Pilot, which is a little yellow book that many yachtsmen still use, began in the early 19th century, I think, when Eldridge, as a young man, had charted these currents, and hour by hour, you could see what was happening in Vineyard Sound. And this was super valuable. He sold this as a broadsheet to the kind of square riggers that were plying these waters, the commercial ships, because many, many ships ended up on the rocks, sailing down Vineyard Sound, but ending up moving sideways towards the islands, unbeknownst to them.
Interesting. The original light there was actually shown from an inn, right? Run by a man named Zaccheus Lumbert, which is a great name. And I guess it was a popular stop for like coastal trading vessels. People like that would stop for the night in the little cove there and visit the inn.
Yeah, I've heard that in the 19th century, up to 200 big square riggers might be found waiting for the tide to turn in Tarpaulin Cove. Wow. And it must have been fairly tight. The cove is maybe a mile wide, but but it's got a sand bottom. It's quite a benign environment, but it's not very big, and that sounds like a lot of big boats in there. But there are still the wrecks of a couple of ships that we know about right around the cove that are buried in sand. Primarily, a coal ship actually wrecked right off the lighthouse in I think 1916, and there's still lumps of coal that show up on the beach and stuff.
Huh. I used to see that in Winthrop, Mass, where I used to live on Boston Harbor. See lumps of coal coming up on the beach. Must have been from a wreck.
Yeah.
So the federal government finally saw fit to build let's say, a real lighthouse at Tarpaulin Cove in 1817. So the Vineyard Sound traffic must have still been really busy at that time.
Well, I think it very much was. Yeah, the inn. There were a few agricultural products produced on these islands. There were famous turnips. Apparently, the soil is very, very sandy and very poor on the islands. But there were certain things that grew well, and there were turnips and I think cheese, and there was some livestock production. But I think it was no one has ever really made money on agriculture in the Elizabeth Islands, my understanding.
Yeah.
And in 1817, there was an eminent domain taking in which the federal government took 7 acres of land from the then owners, which was, I think, the Bowdoin family and the family of Governor Bowdoin of Massachusetts. And that same parcel, 7 acres, is now been transferred to the Fish and Wildlife, Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife Agency, which administers it to this day. It's outlined by a stone wall, at the corner of which there's a small graveyard around the lighthouse.
I want to get back to Tarpaulin Cove in a couple of minutes, but let's talk a bit about Cuttyhunk. Cuttyhunk Island is the westernmost, the outermost of the Elizabeth Islands. And there was a lighthouse there at one time. The light was established there in 1823. And I guess it's pretty obvious, but why was that lighthouse built at that time?
Well, again, I presume it was part of this same impulse. There were a lot of wrecks around Cuttyhunk, maybe more than 100. It was really this a big reef that heads southwest from Cuttyhunk, Sow and Pigs, and there it's really treacherous waters. So I think the lighthouse related to that.
I kind of know the answer to my next question, but I want to get your take on it. And I was there on Cuttyhunk about 20 years ago, so not quite sure what's happened between then and now to the structures. But what happened to the lighthouse on Cuttyhunk? And part 2, is there anything left from that light station on Cuttyhunk?
My understanding is that there was, and you'll know the date of this, I think, but there was a decision made by the Coast Guard to decommission that light and to replace it. The structure was knocked down, and to replace it with a pole that had a light on the top, to the great regret of the people of Cuttyhunk at this time. Everybody is nostalgic for that lighthouse, and that has been reflected in a lot of support for the Tarpaulin Cove Lighthouse. It's not on Cuttyhunk, but it's within the town of Gosnold, and people are very keen that there not be a similar demolition of the only remaining lighthouse in the town.
Yeah, I think it was 46 or 47 when it was torn down.
It was quite a long time ago that it was taken down. The Coast Guard has found themselves in the position of managing historic structures, which is far from their mission. Their mission is to provide aids to navigation and related things. And nowadays, since people don't use lighthouses really as their primary navigation aid, the Coast Guard really wants to get out of repointing old brick lighthouses, and so they've tried to pass this off to other bodies. Yeah, as you know.
Yeah. When I was there on Cuttyhunk 20 years ago and got out to the former lighthouse site, that nondescript steel tower was still standing. I think it was kind of rusty when I was out there. I don't know if it's still the same structure. There was also an oil house, or at least the remains of it from the light station. That was the only building still standing, although I don't think it had a roof. And the foundation of the keeper's house was interesting to see. Yeah. Is that same tower still out there standing?
I believe it is. I've not been to that exact site. Out at the west end of Cuttyhunk, where Sow and Pigs Reef starts, there's a very funny ruin, which is these large pyramidal concrete blocks that were foundations for, I think, military radio tower that was right at the bluff. And that was for World War II. They were doing subwatch out there. Those fell as it eroded, that point eroded, those fell onto the beach, and the fishermen referred to that as Little Egypt, because you have these three big concrete pyramids lying on the beach. And I thought that was a wonderful designation.
Also out at the west end of Cuttyhunk near the light station, there's the memorial to
The
Bartholomew
monument, yeah.
Gosnold, the monument. Yeah.
Yeah, that's on the island in West End Pond, which is in theory where Gosnold built his little stockade in 1603 or whatever. And no one really knows. They're conflicting interpretations of the reports from that time.
Right. My friend Simon Ponsart Roberts, who I co-wrote the book Everyday Heroes, True Story of a Lighthouse Family. When she was a little girl there at the light station, she would play Gosnold, she called it. Gosnold.
That's good.
Yeah, and she liked to pretend she was Rapunzel with her hair flowing down from the lighthouse too.
Excellent.
But she had a good time. What other things is Cuttyhunk Island known for?
Cuttyhunk Island is known for its fishing. It's one of the best fishing spots in New England, with all the current and all of the all the movement of water there. It's always been a site for striped bass and bluefish fishing. There were famous fishing clubs there and on Pesk Island next to it, where before the invention of before leisure airplane travel, people would come to New England and engage in this fishing. There were long spindly piers that went out into the surf zone, and you could sit out on the end of that long pier and cast out into the current. And people caught big 50-pound stripers and things. There's quite a lot of record books. And that faded, of course, with the invention of air travel, and people could go far and wide on vacation. But there are still sort of a few echoes of that to this day. And there are still fishing guides on Cuttyhunk who take you out in Cuttyhunk bass boats. There's a particular boat design that's really associated with Cuttyhunk and is perfect for those waters.
Yeah. My friend Simon, as a little girl, went out fishing one time with Jimmy Cagney, the movie.
Oh, yeah. See, I mean, the Roosevelts, all kinds of people went up there to do this fishing. It was a big deal. Yeah.
So today you can get there by ferry from New Bedford, right?
Yes. And the ferry runs, I think, every day in the summer, but in the winter, it just runs twice a week, Mondays and Fridays. So you're really pretty far out there. It's a solid hour on the ferry to get out there. And there aren't many islands. For example, on the coast of Maine, there's very few islands that are further offshore than that. Right. It's quite an isolated location, and there's no businesses really functioning in the wintertime.
It's a neat place. I'm glad I had the chance to get on there at least once, and I've cruised around at other times.
Yeah.
Let's get back to Tarpaulin Cove. So, how did the Cuttyhunk Historical Society become involved with Tarpaulin Cove Lighthouse?
My involvement really begins with the adoption of the lighthouse by the Historical Society. I kind of organized that effort. When the Coast Guard announced that this could be applied for, that people could obtain these no-cost licenses to sort of adopt a lighthouse, a number of people surfaced, or at least a couple of applicants from, I think, primarily maybe from the mainland, the South Coast, but also from Martha's Vineyard, surfaced. But we were very concerned. The last thing you want is to receive a lighthouse that is in terrible condition, or that is on an eroding bluff where you will need to move the structure. These are very remote locations, and to transport something like a lighthouse is extremely elaborate. And so we were very worried that somebody who had a lot of money would want to adopt this lighthouse as an older person. These applicants were maybe 65 years old, actually my age now, but maybe their kids who then inherited it wouldn't be so enthusiastic and wouldn't really maintain the structure. And that we thought, in the town, we thought, well, this thing's going to fall back into our lap in 20 years, and it's going to need $1 million in repair work. And so this doesn't make any sense. We really should apply as a historical society for this license and maintain it ourselves, to make sure that we are consistently keeping up with the pointing and painting that are required to keep the thing in good shape, and also erosion control on the bluff. If you're going to adopt a lighthouse, you want a very small one that's set well back from the water on a stable piece of land. And this one met many of those criteria. And so we felt comfortable taking it on because we knew we could methodically support it.
The brick lighthouse that still stands there, built in 1891, is now standing by itself. What happened to all the other light station buildings there?
There was a keeper's house. There was a fog bell in a strange pyramidal shingled structure down by the water. There was a shed or two, I believe, as well. And I think in the 1950s or maybe early 60s, those structures, or at least the house, was finally demolished. It had become an attractive nuisance. It had been empty. No one had lived there for more than a decade. And I think the windows had gone and this and that. And so it was removed. All that really is visible are some footings. It didn't have a full foundation. They, I think, were very good at putting these things up in a jiffy in the 1890s. And they had standard plans, and all these buildings look the same, and all the lighthouses look the same, or a lot of them do, with precast elements and very standard structural pieces. And so this house, the house was removed, and there is a little concrete walkway that runs down to the beach, the remains of which persist, and then a number of footings for the house and possibly for a shed or barn. But that's about all that can be seen at the site. There's a little bit of machinery, which maybe was a hauling device or something to bring heavy loads up this little walkway. Can be seen sort of lying in the pond at the bottom of the hill. But
I missed that when I was there.
Yeah, well, you got to get through a lot of catbrier and poison ivy to find that. So that's about all that remains to this day. And then there are markers. There are the Lighthouse Agency markers for the site.
You mentioned that lighthouse is similar to some others. There are a bunch of that class. I would call them siblings or whatever. Curtis Island Light in Camden, Maine, I think is pretty close to being a twin. And some on Cape Ann, Annisquam, and Straitsmouth Island, and Eastern Point are actually all pretty similar brick towers around the same height. Yeah. So let's get back to the island that it's on, Nashan. And again, I've always thought it was pronounced Naushon, but I've been corrected by you and somebody else with the Cuttyhunk Historical Society, and told it's Nashan. Is that a better pronunciation?
Yeah, that's more the way we say it, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Naushon Island is privately owned by the Forbes family, and I guess actually most of the Elizabeth Islands are owned by the Forbes family. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And what is the public access situation to Tarpaulin Cove Lighthouse, to Tarpaulin Cove itself, and to the lighthouse?
Yeah, the policy of the trust that owns Nashan has always been to keep most of our best beaches open to the public. And the great granddaddy of all of our beaches is the beach at Tarpaulin Cove. It's I think more than a mile long, and a lot of our shore is rocky. There's just some sandy bits, so that's really the best of it. And that's always been kept open for public access, and people have been extraordinarily respectful visiting the site. We very rarely encounter material amounts of trash or people attempting to overnight camp or anything like that. So it's been a very successful place, I think. The lighthouse itself, that we don't permit people to go further into the island. It's really beach use that is permitted, but going in further into the island is to expose yourself to a lot of disease-bearing ticks anyway. We have a higher tick infestation of 3 or 4 species than almost anywhere. Long Island, the coast of Connecticut, and these islands and Cape Cod have really high tick infestation and poison ivy and catbrier and all kinds of other unpleasant things. So it's not really an appropriate place to go inland, and we don't permit that. But The lighthouse itself has the 7 acres that were taken by eminent domain in 1817 include 100 yards of coastline and some sandy beach where I think they landed. But they also had a wharf there. There was a probably a timber crib containing rocks that was a wharf at the time the lighthouse was built. It no longer exists in that form, but you can see, for example, on Google Earth, you can look down and you can see a rubble ridge heading out into the water there. That was the old lighthouse wharf. And there are photographs that still exist that show that, but it gets pretty heavily beaten on in an easterly wind, and those things erode pretty rapidly. But nevertheless, there is a significant stretch of coastline which is owned by the Mass Fish and Wildlife, and I think that it's open to walkers and visitors as long as they stay within the perimeter, which is marked by a stone wall.
And there's a yearly open house at the lighthouse, right?
Yes, one of the responsibilities that the Historical Society took on in adopting the lighthouse and taking this unpaid lease and maintaining it was the obligation to make it accessible to the public, and we open it once a year for an open house, usually the second Saturday in August, from 12 to 2 in the afternoon. And at that time, we unlock the lighthouse and staff that so that people can come up and take a look. I remember the first time I went up to the top of the lighthouse, I looked around, I said, "Oh my God, look at the view. You can see ocean for 270 degrees ocean view." And then I thought, oh, of course, that's what this is. It's a lighthouse. It's meant to be visible from as much ocean as possible. So there's a lot of ocean visible in turn from the top of the lighthouse.
Yeah, the cove is all visible. It's a really pretty view. So I was there for the open house a few weeks ago. Had a great time. I had cruised past the island before and taken pictures, from boats, but never had the chance to be on the island before. So that was great. There are a couple of things I want to ask you about that I saw when I was there. One of them was when we're inside the lighthouse and the base, there's this old metal railing that's kind of leaning against the wall in the base. It's an old rusty metal railing that I believe is from the lantern gallery or catwalk, people call it, at the the top of the tower. There's what appears to be not a new railing up there now, but newer than the one that's down on the bottom. Do you know when that railing was replaced? And is there any thought to restoring that historic railing?
When we completed essentially the adoption of the lighthouse from the Coast Guard by the Historical Society about 18 years ago, I think, that railing was in place and it had gaps in it. It was a very strange sensation to walk around that catwalk and not have a complete railing between you and that drop. It was quite heavily corroded. It's made of, I think, of cast iron, which is a very, very resistant material, amazingly resistant. I have a feeling that railing may have been original from 1891, in which case it had withstood an incredible amount of weathering, but it was really no longer safe or complete as a barrier. So we undertook to replace that, and we raised funds, and we commissioned a stainless steel railing, which was then painted black to replace that. It turns out when you unwrap that thing, it's about 50 feet long, which you wouldn't imagine when you're up there. But there's a lot of stainless steel in that, and it was an expensive thing to commission. Mm-hmm. We cut the old railing off in that process, and we just stowed it at the base of the tower. I don't think that we would ever remove the stainless railing and put that one back up, but it is, it probably isn't an original piece of the thing, and rather than dispose of it, we just tucked it in there. I think it's probably stable in there.
Yeah. Wonder if maybe a piece of it could be displayed at the museum on Cuttyhunk, possibly?
Yes, I think they may have one of the balls. There are screw-off balls at all the junctions, and they may have one. In fact, I've got one here as the lighthouse keeper. I have I
Oh,
have one
cool.
that came from that railing. You can see the threading inside. It's got a little note in it to explain what it is, I guess, but it's threaded.
Yeah.
Everything was threaded and assembled. It was all prefabricated elements, like the stair treads to make the spiral staircase, and the platform at the top of the stair, the ladder up into the lantern room, and the whole lantern room structure and the parapet sections were all precast pieces. And I bet they could assemble that thing in their sleep as they built lighthouse after lighthouse.
Yeah.
So the railing was a part of that system, but the part that was the most exposed to the elements.
Right. Right. Well, I'm amazed that that's stainless steel, that railing that's there now. I never would have thought that. I thought it was cast iron, like all the old stuff that's still in place there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we didn't want to do it again.
Yeah, I
We
understand
said,
that.
let's do this once and for all.
Yeah.
So
Oh, it
we
looks like it
thought
was done really.
stainless was the right solution. Yeah.
Oh, it looks great. Looks perfect.
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
And another thing that I wanted to ask you, I don't think any of us knew about this ahead of time, although when I thought back, I knew I had seen references to it. But anyway, what I want to ask you is about the cattle on the island. You certainly see them when you're going up to the lighthouse, and there are a bunch of them in the kind of clearing near the lighthouse. And as we were fixing to leave on the boat, we went down to the beach, and the cows also came down to the beach. We're coming down to the beach around the same time. They actually walked down a very steep path, which was amazing to us. And it was a hot day, so they were going for a dip in the ocean, about chest high, I would say. So please tell me about the cattle on Naushon Island. What kind are they, and why are they there?
Those cattle are belted Galloway cows. The island was about half forested in the last 200 years. It was about half forest and about half pasture land. The pasture land had been created by tenant farmers on the island, and was really there for the grazing of cattle to some degree, but principally sheep. After wool became a very valuable commodity after the War of 1812, I think, around that time, very early 19th century, and better breeds of sheep were found. These Spanish merino sheep had very high wool densities, and it became a very profitable activity to grow sheep and to harvest wool. And that was done for almost 200 years on Nashan, along with many of the other islands. The Martha's Vineyard had 25,000 sheep on. I think they were 2,500 at Nashan. The landscape, the kind of historic landscape, included this mixture of woodland and open grassland. In more recent years, coyotes have arrived on Cape Cod around 1987 and immediately arrived on the island. They swim very well across Woods Hole, and they came out and consumed the sheep herd, the semi-wild sheep that were out on the island, and maintained those grasslands. The landscape began immediately to convert towards thorny scrub and brush. And we thought about how we could maintain our grasslands with an animal that was immune to coyotes. And these cattle breeds, the Longhorn Highland cattle and also the belted Galways, are kind of old breed cows that can live well in a natural landscape. And so we maintain them out there in large part to maintain these historic grasslands, and to which also fosters the kind of ecological diversity of the island.
Are there male and females there?
There's only females there. We have brought a bull from time to time in order to breed the cows, and we may do that again, or we may simply purchase some calves to add to that herd. But the Galways have been very successful, and they don't have the big horns, which the Scottish Highlanders do. The Scottish Highlanders are very intimidating with their enormous horns.
Yes.
At Naushon Island, you can see the Scottish Highlanders, but we decided to use a hornless breed at Naushon for safety.
Well, it was a really unusual and fun sight to see these cows ambling down that steep rocky path and going into the water.
Yes, well, they get very hot in the summer. They're big animals, and they heat up, and they love standing in the water to cool down.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
makes it adds a dimension to a visit to Tarpaulin Cove to share the beach with a large herd of cattle.
It sure does. There was a group of girls there when we were there. These girls went out, waded out, and were trying to pet one of the cows, and the cow wasn't real anxious to be petted.
Yeah,
But
those cattle are quite wild, and we don't handle them at all. We can lead them places with a bucket of grain, but we don't. We never handle them, and so they are not used to that, and they can panic. It can be dangerous to get too close to those animals.
yeah, I was wondering about that. The cow seemed fine, but was kind of edging away from them.
It makes them very anxious. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So anybody listening who goes there, don't pet the cows, leave them alone.
Right.
I got some great pictures of them.
Yeah.
So just one more question about the lighthouse. Are there any preservation, renovation type projects planned at this time for the lighthouse?
Really, our goal is to keep it standing and keep it as is in good condition, preserving all of the original elements where we can. In the case of the railing, we found that we had to replace an old element with a newer element that was a facsimile, and we got full approval to do that. And we seek to keep the original materials intact to the degree we possibly can. We did have to reshingle the roof of the little doghouse entryway recently because those had deteriorated, and that's really rough on the structure if you don't have a really solid roof. So we replaced that, but with similar cedar shake shingles. So we don't expect, for example, to rebuild the fog bell structure or the keeper's house. It's quite stable and it's relatively inexpensive to maintain as a simple masonry structure, but it does weather, and we have to get up there. We've done 2 rounds of maintenance work. When we adopted the tower, it had just been painted by the Coast Guard, and we painted it probably 8 years later and then did it 8 years later again. I think that was about the spacing, because that seemed to be the interval that was necessary in terms of the weathering of the paint.
That sounds about right. And it looks great as far as that goes. So was the last time it was painted just a couple of years ago? Is that about right?
Yeah, just a couple of years ago, we painted. And in fact, each time we've gone a little beyond. So the first time we replaced the railing. The second time we sandblasted the catwalk from beneath. There was those castings were rusting some, and we had not really brought equipment up to deal with those. And so this time we did that. So we tried to pick an item that might need work. One day it might be the roof or the glazing in the lantern room that might need help. But generally it's a very, very solid structure that's designed to last forever. And we're going to make sure that's true.
Yeah. Well, it looks good. Could you tell me just a little bit about the museum on Cuttyhunk? The Historical Society has a museum there.
Yeah, there's a museum of the Elizabeth Islands on Cuttyhunk. It's open during the summer, and you can find it on the web, either through the Cuttyhunk Historical Society, I think is the right thing to search. And it has a lot of interesting material on the history of these islands. The islands, while now relatively remote and really used for more like leisure or summer use, at those in the early years, in the late 18th and early 19th century, they were really the front lines in the case of warfare. For example, during the War of the American Revolution and during the War of 1812, there was significant action. The British Navy was the primary military force in the world, the foremost military force in the world, and was active around the islands. And so it was a risky and difficult place to live in time of warfare in the early 19th century, and people moved away after 1812. The tenant farmers left Nashan. Many of the families moved to Maine because they found it a hard place to live in a way that it is no longer. But during the Second World War, again, there were submarines along those coasts, German submarines, and there were bunkers built on all those islands for subwatch. So again, just the coastal exposure means that at times one is plunged into the sort of the foreground of current events. We've also found ourselves kind of at the forefront of alternative energy development, because these little islands have always been self-sufficient in electrical power. They're microgrids. They don't have cables to the mainland. And in recent years, people have gotten very interested in microgrid as a structure for the mainland power grid. So they come to these lost places to look at what we've done. And both in Cuttyhunk and at Nashan, we have systems that are solar driven systems with big battery systems to run these villages at all night with generator backup. We used to just run generators 24/7, and now we absorb sunlight in the daytime and use it at night. And that again has sort of pushed us into the forefront. People are quite interested in those technologies on islands.
Yeah.
So it sort of relates to the problem of generating light in a lighthouse, right? This is how we keep the lights on now.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to ask you about that. You personally have had quite a bit to do with the establishment.
Yeah, I'm an electric light commissioner in the town of Gosnold and was involved in those two projects. And I work with the Island Institute in Rockland, Maine, on energy sharing experiences with all the main islands, with Block Island, and even with the Aleutians and the South Pacific Islands. There's a lot of exchange of information about alternative energy solutions for islands.
That's great. So today, approximately what percentage of your power is coming from solar on those islands?
It's about 2/3. Each of the islands has its own little solar setup, but the biggest one, of course, is at Cuttyhunk and delivers about 2/3 of the power for the island. The generators do run from time to time in backup if the load is extra heavy, or when the nights are long or the weather's bad, we don't get as much solar as we need. At Naushon, we're just replacing our batteries now, and we should be getting more like 95% of our electricity from solar as a result of the expanded battery capacity. So that's been an interesting feature of working on the islands.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The lighthouse itself, of course, the light in the lighthouse is maintained by the Coast Guard still, but is that solar powered?
Yeah, the way lighthouses are powered these days is, it used to be that you needed a 8-foot high Fresnel lens made by French prism makers, this very highly engineered system to magnify and focus the light from a little whale oil lamp. And now that whole apparatus, in the case of Tarpaulin Cove, it had a 4th order Fresnel lens, which was removed and is probably in some warehouse in Washington, D.C. But it's been replaced by something about the size of your head, which is a plastic system with a little LED in it that flashes in the same pattern that the lighthouse used to.
Yeah.
And it's run by one car battery and one solar panel. It takes very little power to generate a signal that is very visible. It's startling.
Yeah. So I have one final question for you. And of course, this is for bonus points. Okay. What has been your favorite part of your association with the Elizabeth Islands, and particularly Nashan Island?
Well, I'm a biologist by education, and I think the kind of the role of the islands from a conservation perspective in the whole region is really pivotal. And I'm very pleased that we've been able to maintain the islands in a very wild state, and they're big enough to really maintain populations of animals and plants that have trouble elsewhere. And I think that's been, in a way, the most special part of that place.
Yeah. I commend you for all that you're doing there. Those of us lighthouse buffs like me, of course, are interested in the lighthouse and the care of it and the history of it and all that. But what you're talking about, the natural environment there, is, I think, the most important aspect of islands like that. So it's wonderful to visit an island that's so unspoiled.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that that people can come and visit the beaches, and also I think that the view of the natural landscape from the water and from Martha's Vineyard, for example, where there's much more development, has always made it a very popular phenomenon. That you could go out and sail along that coast and really not see any structures or any development. It makes for you can sort of envision what these islands were when Gosnold first appeared and took a look at them. And of course, there were a lot of people living there then, and we've now have LiDAR overflights that have given us images of the ground under the vegetation, and we begin to see things, little excavations and things that may date to before contact. We don't have many vestiges of the Wampanoag society that used to be there, but I'm sure there were many people living there before contact.
Sure. Probably mostly in the summer, fishing and so forth.
Yeah, apparently they were seasonal as we are, and they moved inland during the winter time and came out for the clam banks and fishing and berries and things in the summer.
Yeah. For people listening who might not know, there's still a Wampanoag population on Martha's Vineyard, on the western end of Martha's Vineyard, Aquina.
Yeah, and there's a Wampanoag village reproduced at Plymouth Plantation, which is very interesting as well. But there's quite an active tribe with 3 branches in our region.
Right, on Cape Cod mainland as well. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Well, the Elizabeth Islands and that whole region, Cape Cod, the other islands, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, a little farther out, but it's just a fascinating part of the world. And the Elizabeth Islands, again, I think are something that most people don't know about, but worth exploring, worth taking the ferry out to Cuttyhunk. And if people have a chance to visit Tarpaulin Cove and your open house day, visit the lighthouse. I recommend it. We had a great time, and you don't often get to swim with cows. So again, you and the Historical Society do great work at Cuttyhunk and Nashan. And Paul Elias, I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much, Jeremy.
You can read about the Cuttyhunk Historical Society and their museum at cuttyhunkhistoricalsociety.org. And the book Everyday Heroes, the true story of a lighthouse family, about Simon Ponsart Roberts' childhood on Cuttyhunk and Martha's Vineyard, is available on Amazon. I think you know a little bit about that book, Jeremy, don't you?
Well, yes, I do. Simon and I worked together for more than 10 years putting that book together. She has so many good stories, and I know a lot of our listeners correspond with Simon, and I'm working on featuring her in an upcoming episode of the podcast. Hopefully that'll happen fairly soon. I want to thank Paul Elias again for today's interview. I had such an interesting time visiting Tarpaulin Cove Lighthouse not long ago, as we talked about in the interview, and it was really cool seeing the cows.
Yeah, he sent some pictures of the cows.
Yeah, the cows went down this steep path down into took a dip in the ocean because it was a hot day. That's something neat. I had no idea that was there before I went, and I don't think I'll see cows in the ocean anywhere else. I don't expect to anyway. Probably
not.
So I had a great time there, and I have some history with Cuttyhunk also. I visited Cuttyhunk Island with Simon Ponsart Roberts and her daughter and some other people some years ago, about 20 years ago. So I thought it'd be nice to focus on kind of an out-of-the-way area, the Elizabeth Islands, for a change. Usually on this podcast, we're talking about lighthouses that are tourist attractions, but I thought people might enjoy hearing about an area that's way off the beaten path for most people.
As always, many thanks to all the volunteers, members, and staff of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. To learn more about the organization, check out uslhs.org.
If you work to preserve lighthouses or any kind of history, thank you for everything you do. We're all on the same team. If you listen to this podcast on a platform that allows you to post reviews, please rate and review us.
The American naturalist Henry David Thoreau once wrote, and I quote, "The question is not what you look at, but what you see." End quote.
As always, thanks for listening, and
keep a good light.
I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine.